By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered its most decisive phase. The once invincible Japanese Empire, which had stretched from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, was now bleeding from 1,000 cuts. For over 2 years, the United States had been carving a brutal path westward, one island, one reef, one patch of jungle at a time. It began with Guadalcanal in 1942, a name that burned into American memory. From there, the strategy evolved. The architects of this plan, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, General Douglas MacArthur, and Admiral Ernest King, understood something profound. Japan's empire could not be beaten by invading every stronghold. It had to be bypassed, isolated, and starved into irrelevance. Thus emerged one of the most daring concepts of modern warfare: island hopping. Instead of battering through every fortified base, U.S. forces would leapfrog across the Pacific, capturing only the islands that mattered, those that could host airfields, serve as supply bases, or bring Japan's homeland within bomber range. Each conquest became a stepping stone. Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Iwaitak, tiny dots on the map but soaked in unimaginable blood. The Japanese called them unsinkable aircraft carriers. The Americans turned them into real ones. By early 1944, the Central Pacific Campaign had smashed through the Marshall Islands, placing Japan's defensive perimeter in crisis. The Imperial Navy had been humbled at Midway 2 years earlier, its veteran pilots lost in a single catastrophic blow. Now, Japan's naval power was a shadow of its former self, spread thin, fuel-starved, and dependent on fragile supply lines, but Tokyo refused to see it. Within the walls of the Imperial General Headquarters, optimism still reigned. Propaganda films showed calm, victorious generals. Maps painted the Pacific in comforting red. Reports of defeats were sanitized or dismissed as temporary setbacks. The Japanese high command believed that the Americans would eventually tire, that democracy lacked the stomach for a long, grinding war. They underestimated the industrial fury of a nation that had transformed its economy into a war machine. By May 1944, the United States was producing one aircraft every 5 minutes, one ship every day, and one Liberty cargo vessel every week. Japan could not match even a fraction of it. Yet its military doctrine, rooted in honor, obedience, and self-sacrifice, left no room for retreat or pragmatism. It was in this climate of denial that Japan viewed the next target, the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were considered sacred territory, technically part of the Japanese homeland since their annexation after World War I. Losing them would not just be a military defeat, it would be a psychological catastrophe. But the Americans had already chosen them. Admiral Nimitz's strategy was bold: seize the Marianas, establish B-29 bomber bases, and bring the Japanese home islands within direct striking range for the first time. From Saipan's runways, U.S. bombers could reach Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, the industrial heart of Japan. The invasion of Saipan would be the opening move in that plan, a strike so deep that it would challenge everything. Japan believed about its own invulnerability, while Japanese generals mocked the idea of Americans reaching the Marianas. The U.S. Navy was already assembling a fleet of unprecedented scale. It would sail under the code name Operation Forager, a campaign that would decide the fate of the Pacific. The Japanese expected an attack on smaller islands like Palau or Truk. They didn't realize that the next wave would crash directly onto a piece of what they considered their own soil. In the calm waters of Pearl Harbor, Task Force 58 gathered: aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, over 535 warships carrying the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions and the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division. It was the largest amphibious armada the Pacific had ever seen. As the fleet departed Hawaii, Nimitz issued a simple order: seize the Marianas, cut Japan's lifeline, bring the war home to them. The course of the Pacific War was about to change forever, and the Japanese didn't see it coming. Saipan, a tropical island only 23 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide, was about to become the center of the Pacific War from the air. It looked peaceful: turquoise reefs surrounding lush green hills, small villages dotted along the coastline, and sugarcane fields swaying in the warm wind. But beneath that beauty, Japan had turned Saipan into a fortress. More than 30,000 Japanese troops occupied the island, supported by 5,000 naval personnel and thousands of laborers and civilians. They had spent months constructing a labyrinth of caves, tunnels, and hidden gun positions. On the beaches, concrete bunkers were buried beneath sand and coral, waiting for an unseen enemy. The man responsible for defending this bastion was Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, a stern officer shaped by years in the Imperial Army. Once a loyal aide to Emperor Hirohito, Saito believed his duty was absolute, that Saipan must be held or destroyed in the process. For him, surrender was worse than death. His counterpart in the naval forces was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same man who had commanded the Japanese carrier fleet that struck Pearl Harbor. Now, less than 3 years later, he found himself stranded on Saipan, his ships gone, his air power decimated, his legacy already slipping into ruin. Together, Saito and Nagumo prepared for what they called a decisive battle. They had no illusions of victory, only of honor. Japanese doctrine dictated that the Americans must be inflicted with maximum casualties. If Saipan could become a graveyard for tens of thousands of U.S. troops, perhaps Japan could negotiate peace from strength. In Tokyo, such fantasies still sounded possible. Reports from field commanders painted Saipan as an impregnable island. The generals smiled in meetings, assuring the emperor that the Marianas were safe. They smirked at the term island hopping, dismissing it as Western impatience, a brute force tactic that ignored the spiritual power of the Japanese soldier. But far across the Pacific, the U.S. planners saw something very different. For Admiral Nimitz and General Holland Howland Mad Smith, Saipan was the keystone of the Pacific Wall. Capture it and Japan's supply routes would collapse. Its air defense line would be breached. Its people, for the first time, would hear the thunder of American bombers above their homes. The preparations for Operation Forager were monumental. The assault force gathered in the Marshall Islands, training relentlessly for the amphibious landings. Marines rehearsed beach assaults on mock islands built to resemble Saipan's coastline. Navy Seabees assembled floating docks, fuel lines, and portable hospitals. Every inch of the invasion was planned, down to the hour and tide. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Raymond Spruance took command of the Fifth Fleet, the same commander who had triumphed at Midway 2 years earlier. His task was clear: deliver the Marines to the beaches, hold off the Japanese fleet, and ensure Saipan's capture at any cost. To soften the island's defenses, the U.S. Navy unleashed one of the most intense bombardments of the Pacific War. On June 13, 1944, battleships including the Tennessee, California, and Maryland opened fire. Shells weighing 400 pounds screamed through the air, exploding across Saipan's ridges and jungles. The ground trembled for miles. From their bunkers, Japanese soldiers waited. Saito's men endured the bombardment in silence. When the shelling paused, they emerged to repair positions, reload, and prepare ambushes. They knew the Americans would come, but none could imagine the scale of what was about to land. The U.S. fleet stretched from horizon to horizon. On the morning of June 15, 1944, thousands of landing craft churned toward Saipan's western shore. Inside them, Marines gripped their rifles, silent except for the hum of engines and the distant thunder of naval guns. For many, this would be their first major combat. For others, veterans of Tarawa and Kwajalein, it would be another test of survival. The difference this time was sheer scale. 50,000 men backed by overwhelming air and sea power. As the first waves approached the beach, Japanese artillery opened fire. Mortar shells erupted around the landing craft, throwing water and bodies into the air. Machine guns tore through the surf. The invasion of Saipan had begun. The Japanese had smirked at island hopping, believing it a reckless dream. But in these first hours, that smirk began to fade. What followed in the next 72 hours would become one of the most shocking, brutal, and transformative moments in the entire Pacific War, where arrogance met annihilation, and 50,000 Marines carved their mark into history. The genius of island hopping lay not in brute force, but in calculation. By mid-1944, the United States had mastered a rhythm of war that Japan could neither predict nor match. Instead of wasting months assaulting every island, the U.S. would strike only those that mattered strategically, leaving others to wither in isolation. Saipan represented the boldest leap yet, a direct thrust into the heart of Japan's defensive circle. It was 2,400 kilometers from Tokyo, but only 1,300 kilometers from the next objective, the Philippines. From its airfields, B-29 superfortresses could finally strike the Japanese homeland. The American assault plan divided Saipan's western coast into 4 landing zones. Beaches Red 1 to Green 2, stretching across 8 kilometers of coastline. The 2nd Marine Division would land on the right. The 4th Marine Division on the left, and the 27th Army Division would follow once the beachhead was secure. Behind them lay the most powerful naval task force ever assembled in the Pacific: 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, and 11 cruisers, providing around-the-clock bombardment and air cover. It was modern warfare's orchestra, timed, synchronized, and devastatingly efficient. But Saipan was different. Unlike previous atolls, it had deep jungles, hills, and ravines, perfect for ambush. The Japanese had dug in not just along the beaches, but within the island itself, turning every ridge into a kill zone. The American planners knew the landing would be brutal, but they believed that firepower and momentum would prevail. This was the mathematics of modern strategy: sacrifice measured in miles, attrition calculated against time. Every island taken brought them closer to Japan's doorstep. Every victory shortened the war by weeks or months. Yet each success came at a price counted in human lives. In the gray dawn of June 15th, as landing craft rocked in the swells, the Marines stared at the smoke rising from Saipan. The air smelled of diesel, salt, and gunpowder. The bombardment had churned the coastline into black mud. Inside one of the boats, Private First Class Johnny Chambers of the 4th Marine Division clutched a photo of his wife. He had survived Tarawa, barely. He told a friend he wasn't sure he'd make it through another one. Around him, men joked quietly, hiding the tremor in their voices. When the green light flashed, the ramps dropped, and hell opened. Machine gun fire ripped into the surf. Mortar rounds exploded in plumes of white spray. Marines leapt into waist-deep water, rifles held high, stumbling forward through a storm of bullets. Those who reached the sand found no cover, only flat, open beach. It felt like walking into a furnace, one survivor recalled later. The first 3 waves were almost annihilated. Tanks tried to advance but bogged down in the sand. Amphibious tractors burned under artillery hits. Men who dove for cover found the coral too shallow to hide behind. Still, they pushed on. By nightfall, more than 8,000 Marines were ashore, at the cost of 2,000 casualties. The beaches were littered with wreckage, smoke, and the dead. Medics crawled through fire to pull wounded men to safety. Corpsmen marked the fallen with small wooden crosses, sometimes just a helmet stuck on a rifle. For the Japanese defenders, it was a moment of disbelief. The Americans kept coming, wave after wave, even when torn apart. They had expected hesitation, fear, perhaps retreat. Instead, they saw determination unlike anything they had faced before. That night, under the red glow of burning oil tanks, both sides prepared for the next day. One side desperate to hold, the other unwilling to stop. Saipan became a showcase for the mechanized brutality of the modern age. Where Japanese soldiers relied on courage, bayonets, and hidden tunnels, the Americans brought machines that could erase entire positions in seconds. Offshore, the battleship USS California fired 14-inch shells that smashed through concrete bunkers. Carrier-based Hellcats strafed Japanese trenches with machine gun fire. Flamethrower tanks, the Satans of the 2nd Marine Division, rolled forward, spraying sheets of fire into cave mouths. It was not just overwhelming firepower, it was a new language of war. Coordination between air, sea, and land had reached a level of precision unseen before. Spotter planes relayed real-time corrections to naval guns. Amphibious radios allowed Marines to call in artillery on targets barely 50 meters ahead. To the Japanese defenders, this was beyond comprehension. They had trained for close combat, for hand-to-hand banzai charges, not for invisible artillery that could obliterate them from beyond sight. Inside their caves, soldiers prayed, waiting for their moment to die usefully. But technology had rewritten the rules of valor. Courage meant little when the enemy could burn a mountain before a single sword was drawn. For the Americans, it was the proof of industrial dominance, that mass production could become a weapon as deadly as any rifle. Every shell, every tank, every aircraft represented factories, workers, and resources Japan could no longer hope to match. By the end of the first day, the U.S. had secured a tenuous foothold, and Japan's defensive line had already begun to crumble under the weight of progress. The war on Saipan was no longer a contest of men. It was a collision between two centuries, one of honor, the other of industry. The battle for Saipan was not only a clash of armies, it was a collision of philosophies. On one side stood Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, an officer molded by Japan's imperial tradition. Trained to believe that death in battle was the highest form of duty, he viewed surrender as shame not just upon himself, but upon the emperor. Saito had ordered his troops to fight until the last man. His command echoed across the island. "I will defend Saipan to the end. There will be no retreat. There will be no surrender. We die with honor." He shared command with Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who once led the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu at Pearl Harbor. Now, in tragic irony, Nagumo's war had come full circle. From the hunter, he had become the hunted, forced into a defensive role on land, stripped of his fleet and command. Nagumo and Saito represented the last embers of Japan's old pride. But beneath their unity was quiet despair. They had no air cover, limited ammunition, and no hope of reinforcement. Their only advantage was terrain and fanaticism. Across the sea, Lieutenant General Holland M. Howlin' Mad Smith commanded the American landings. Known for his volcanic temper and ruthless efficiency, Smith was a Marine legend, a disciplinarian who believed in precision above all else. He respected courage but despised chaos. Smith's partnership with Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded the naval forces, was an uneasy one, a relationship built on professionalism rather than friendship. Spruance was calm, analytical, and cautious. Smith was loud, impatient, and aggressive. But together, they represented the perfect balance of intellect and fury that the Pacific Campaign demanded. Their leadership styles reflected their nations. Saito fought for an idea that could no longer win. Smith fought for a system that learned, adapted, and refused to break. By the second day of the invasion, that difference became visible in blood and fire. The Japanese soldier of Saipan was not driven by strategy. He was driven by Bushido, the samurai code of honor that preached death over defeat. From the moment the first shells landed, most defenders accepted they would never leave the island alive. In the tunnels of Mount Tapokau, priests and officers delivered speeches on sacrifice. Soldiers tied rising sun headbands around their brows, carrying grenades for the enemy, and one for themselves. To them, the Americans were invaders who had lost their spirit, soft men relying on machines. They believed that one Japanese soldier fighting with heart could kill 10 Americans who fought with steel. But Saipan shattered that illusion. The Americans kept advancing, relentless, methodical, almost mechanical. For every Japanese machine gun that fell silent, a new wave of Marines filled the gap. For every counterattack, naval artillery answered with thunder from the sea. Psychological warfare became as real as bullets. Japanese soldiers who tried to hide in caves found themselves burned alive by flamethrowers. Entire platoons were buried when bulldozers sealed tunnel mouths under tons of earth. Each night, loudspeakers broadcast messages urging surrender, promises of medical care, food, and life, almost none accepted. To surrender was to betray family, emperor, and soul, so they fought on, until death was all that remained. Among the Americans, the shock was equally deep. Marines who had once respected the courage of their enemy now saw something different, a fanaticism that defied reason. A private wrote in his journal, "They fight like ghosts. You can shoot them 10 times and they still crawl toward you. I don't understand it. It's like they want to die." Saipan became a psychological crucible. The U.S. Marines hardened, their pity replaced by pragmatism. The Japanese, trapped in an unbreakable code, began to die for an empire that no longer existed beyond radio silence. Before Saipan, the Japanese High Command had dismissed the American advance as clumsy, a war of attrition Japan could outlast. Generals in Tokyo scoffed at the thought that barbarians from across the ocean could ever threaten the homeland. They underestimated two things: industrial momentum and moral adaptation. America's ability to learn from mistakes, to turn disaster into doctrine, became its greatest weapon. The failures at Tarawa led to innovations in landing craft, pre-landing bombardments, and medical evacuation. Each island improved the next assault. Japan, meanwhile, was locked in pride. Defeat was unthinkable, and so it could never be studied. When reports from Saipan's early fighting reached Tokyo, many were censored. The generals refused to believe the Americans had landed in such strength. They accused field officers of exaggeration, of cowardice. But by the time the truth arrived and that 50,000 U.S. troops were ashore, backed by hundreds of tanks and planes, it was too late. The Imperial Navy scrambled to organize a counterattack. What emerged would be one of the largest carrier battles in history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought even as Saipan burned. For the Japanese generals who once smirked at the notion of island hopping, the coming days would erase that arrogance forever. The Americans were not merely invading islands. They were dismantling an empire, one wave, 1 mile, 1 hour at a time. And as the battle for Saipan reached its third day, the skies above the island began to rumble, the sound of a new confrontation that would seal Japan's fate. June 15, 1944, the first 72 hours. The horizon burned red before dawn. The naval guns that had thundered through the night fell silent, replaced by the sound of engines. Hundreds of landing craft cutting through the waves toward Saipan's western beaches. The assault had begun in full force. At 0700 hours, the first waves of Marines from the 2nd and 4th Divisions hit the beaches near Charan Kanoa. The plan was simple on paper: secure the beachhead, push inland, and link both divisions before nightfall. But Saipan's defenders had other plans. The Japanese had allowed the first waves to land almost unopposed. Then, as the Americans bunched together on the sand, they opened fire. Mortars and machine guns erupted from concealed bunkers. Artillery shells crashed down from the ridges above. Entire squads vanished in explosions that turned the surf crimson. A Marine lieutenant later wrote, "It felt like the ocean itself was on fire. Landing craft were torn apart before they could unload. Tanks bogged down in soft sand or hit hidden mines. The beach became a slaughterhouse. Yet somehow the line moved forward. By mid-morning, despite thousands of casualties, U.S. forces had pushed 400 meters inland. Naval gunfire from offshore battleships pounded Japanese positions, carving temporary breathing space. Carrier planes screamed overhead, strafing ridges and trench lines. Amid the chaos, command was almost impossible. Radios jammed, units became mixed, and officers fell one by one. But the Marines kept advancing. For every position lost, 2 more were gained. By nightfall, the Americans had secured a fragile foothold nearly 1.5 kilometers deep, enough to bring in armor, artillery, and reinforcements. As darkness fell on June 15th, the Japanese prepared their response. General Saito ordered a massive banzai counterattack to drive the invaders back into the sea. His men gathered under the shattered palm trees, their faces painted with soot, their swords gleaming in the moonlight. Around 1,000 soldiers moved silently toward the American lines. At midnight, they charged. Screaming the Emperor's name, they stormed through the dark, bayonets fixed, grenades clutched in their fists. The Marines were caught off guard. Flares lit up the night sky as machine guns opened fire, cutting down wave after wave. The attackers kept coming, climbing over their own dead to close the distance. For 30 minutes, the beaches turned into chaos. Close combat erupted among the dunes. Rifles fired at point-blank range, knives and entrenching tools swung in desperation. When the smoke cleared, the sand was littered with over 700 Japanese bodies. The attack had failed. By the dawn of June 16th, the reality of the invasion began to set in. The Japanese command realized the Americans were not just probing. They were here to stay. Every ridge, every cave, every gun position became a battleground. The Americans advanced yard by yard, often fighting for a single tree line or bunker. Flamethrower tanks led the way, incinerating pillboxes while riflemen followed to clear the survivors. The smell of burning oil and flesh hung heavy over the island. For the defenders, the nightmare deepened. Japanese artillery positions, once thought invisible, were spotted and destroyed by naval shells with terrifying precision. Saito's communication lines broke down. Ammunition began to run low. Entire companies were reduced to scattered survivors hiding among the rocks. But surrender was never an option. In one intercepted message, a Japanese officer wrote, "We will fight to the end. If ammunition runs out, we will attack with bayonet. If bayonet breaks, we will bite the enemy's throat." On June 17th, the Americans achieved a critical breakthrough. After 2 days of relentless fighting, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions finally linked their lines in the center, creating a continuous front across the island. The beachhead was secure. Reinforcements poured in, artillery, tanks, and supplies. Over 50,000 American troops now stood on Saipan, entrenched, supplied, and ready to advance inland. For the first time, the Japanese faced the full weight of American military power on what they considered home territory. That same day, Admiral Spruance received reports of Japanese carrier movements to the north. The Imperial Navy was coming, desperate to save Saipan. But the Americans were ready. Above the beaches, black plumes of smoke rose into the sky. The island that Japanese generals had dismissed as unreachable was now firmly in enemy hands. The smirk had vanished, replaced by silence and disbelief. In the shattered bunkers, General Saito looked out toward the sea. The horizon, once Japan's shield, had become its enemy. The battle was only beginning. But the outcome was already written, not in words, but in the thunder of a new empire rising. June 18 to 25, 1944, the struggle for the heart of Saipan. By the 4th day, Saipan was no longer a tropical island, it was a furnace. Every tree, every patch of grass, every hill had been shredded by artillery. The air smelled of gunpowder, burnt coconut, and death. The Japanese had transformed the island's geography into a labyrinth of defense. Machine gun nests were hidden inside coral cliffs. Mortars were buried in caves with firing slits disguised as rocks. Snipers moved between trees like ghosts. And beneath it all, an underground tunnel system connected bunkers and command posts, allowing the defenders to appear and vanish like smoke. American soldiers called it the island that bled men. On June 18th, the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division landed to relieve the exhausted Marines and take over part of the line. Their task: capture Aslito Airfield, a crucial strip in the island's south. The airfield was defended by fanatical Japanese troops who refused to yield an inch. The Americans fought for each hangar, each trench, each shattered plane wreck. By sunset, Aslito was in American hands, and by the next morning, engineers were already clearing the runway. Within 24 hours, U.S. fighters and bombers began taking off from the same strip the Japanese had built. It was a stunning reversal. Saipan had begun serving the very force sent to destroy it, but the battle for the island's center was far from over. The key objective now was Mount Tapochau, the island's highest peak. From its summit, one could see the entire island, the beaches, the villages, and the advancing American lines. Whoever held Tapochau controlled Saipan. The climb began on June 20th. The slopes were riddled with caves, each one a fortress. Mortar rounds whistled down from above as Marines clawed their way upward, using flamethrowers and grenades to clear every crevice. The heat was suffocating. Water ran out. Men collapsed from exhaustion. One Marine described it later. Every step forward felt like walking into another man's grave. By the end of the day, after brutal hand-to-hand combat and dozens of small skirmishes, the Americans reached the top. The view was breathtaking and horrifying. Below them stretched a landscape of total destruction. The southern half of the island was in American hands. The north burned. From the summit, U.S. spotters could now direct naval gunfire and airstrikes with terrifying accuracy. Japanese strongpoints that had survived for days were wiped out in minutes. There was nowhere left to hide. Then came news that changed everything. On June 19th, as the ground battle raged, Admiral Raymond Spruance's fleet to the north engaged the Imperial Navy in what would later be known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier battle in history. The Japanese launched wave after wave of aircraft toward the American task force and nearly 400 planes in one day. But U.S. radar, superior aircraft, and veteran pilots shredded the attacks. The result was a massacre the pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the time it was over, Japan had lost over 300 aircraft and 3 carriers, effectively ending its ability to launch large-scale naval air operations for the rest of the war. The men fighting on Saipan didn't know all the details, but when they looked up, they could see the sky clear of enemy planes. The realization spread slowly. The Imperial Navy was gone. No reinforcements would come. For the Japanese soldiers still fighting on the island, that truth was devastating. General Saito's situation became desperate. Ammunition was nearly gone. Food was scarce. Communications were collapsing. Every night men slipped away from their positions to drink from muddy puddles or scavenge the bodies of the dead. Still, they refused to surrender. Orders from Tokyo were clear: die, but do not yield Saipan. As American forces pushed northward, they encountered not just soldiers, but civilians. Entire families had taken refuge in the caves, hiding from bombardment. Many had been told by Japanese propaganda that the Americans would torture and kill them. Some women, clutching their children, chose to leap from cliffs rather than be captured. It was a tragedy beyond the battlefield, a haunting testament to the psychological war Japan had waged on its own people. On June 23rd, the Americans reached the outskirts of Garapan, the island's largest town. What had once been a peaceful settlement was now a smoldering ruin. Snipers fired from broken windows, grenades rolled down staircases, and corpses lined the streets. When Garapan finally fell, only the island's northern cliffs remained, the last refuge for the shattered remnants of Saito's army. By June 25th, the Japanese command was cornered. Fewer than 3,000 combat-ready soldiers remained out of the original 30,000. Most were wounded, starving, or out of ammunition. But even in defeat, they prepared for one final act, one that would be remembered as one of the most tragic and terrifying moments of the Pacific War. They called it the Great Banzai Charge, the largest suicidal assault of World War. June 25-26, 1944, the Great Banzai Charge night had fallen over northern Saipan. The moonlight bled across shattered trees, collapsed bunkers, and the twisted remains of trucks and field guns. The island had gone eerily silent. Only the whisper of the sea and the distant cries of the wounded echoed through the humid darkness. In a cave near the final Japanese command post, General Yoshitsugu Saito lay on a stretcher, his uniform tattered and his body riddled with shrapnel. He could barely move. Around him, what was left of his staff stood silently, eyes hollow, faces drawn. The air smelled of smoke and blood. Saito knew the truth now. The island was lost. The Emperor's army had failed. He gave his final order in a calm, steady voice. The fate of the Empire now rests on each man's spirit. Attack. Until all are dead. Moments later, his chief of staff, General Igeda, bowed deeply, then raised his sword and performed seppuku, the ritual suicide of honor. Saito followed, firing his pistol into his chest. Outside, the last 3,000 Japanese soldiers gathered in the pale light. Some wore only bandages and rags. Others carried no rifles, just bayonets, swords, or sharpened sticks tied to poles. A few held grenades clutched to their chests. They began to chant, "Tenno Heika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" At 4:45 a.m., June 26, 1944, a low rumble rolled through the jungle. Then suddenly the night exploded. Thousands of Japanese soldiers surged out of the darkness in a human wave, screaming, charging, firing wildly. Bayonets gleamed under the moon as they stormed toward the American positions around Tanapag Plain, where units of the 27th Infantry Division were resting after days of battle. The Americans were caught completely off guard. Many had stacked their rifles and were sleeping when the attack hit. The first line of defense, the 105th Infantry Regiment, 1st and 2nd Battalions, was overrun within minutes. Entire companies were wiped out before they could even form a firing line. Machine gun crews were bayoneted in their foxholes. The Japanese stormed through, shouting and stabbing, unstoppable in their suicidal fury. Captain Thomas Bailey, commanding Company B, recalled, "They came like a flood. No man could count them. You fired until your barrel smoked, and they still kept coming." The chaos spread through the American rear. Trucks caught fire. Ammunition dumps exploded. Wounded men crawled into trenches, fighting hand-to-hand with their attackers. Some of the Japanese used captured American weapons. Others detonated grenades in groups, taking Marines with them. By dawn, the ground was slick with blood. The 27th Infantry's command post was under siege. Officers formed ad hoc firing lines using clerks, medics, and engineers. Mortars fired at point-blank range. Tanks rolled forward, crushing bodies under their treads. Still, the Japanese pressed on. When the dust settled around 9 a.m., the scale of the assault became clear. The Great Banzai Charge had involved nearly every remaining able-bodied Japanese soldier, over 3,000 men, supported by another 1,000 wounded who crawled or limped after them. In the span of just a few hours, they had annihilated 2 entire American battalions and nearly 650 men killed and 1,000 wounded, the highest single-day U.S. Army casualty toll in the entire Pacific War, but the cost to Japan was absolute. By mid-morning, the American counterattack began. Sherman tanks and heavy machine guns scythed through what was left of the Japanese line. The attackers had no ammunition left, only bayonets and desperation. At Tanapag village, the final resistance collapsed. The plain was carpeted with bodies, Japanese and American tangled together in death. The survivors were few. Some Japanese soldiers pretended to be dead, only to rise again when a Marine passed by, detonating grenades to take their enemy with them. By the time the smoke cleared, the Japanese garrison on Saipan had ceased to exist. Out of 30,000 defenders, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, most of them wounded or unconscious. For the Americans, victory came at a staggering cost, nearly 14,000 casualties, including over 3,400 dead. Yet even as the guns fell silent, the horror continued. On the cliffs of Marpi Point, hundreds of Japanese civilians, men, women, and children, gathered after hearing false propaganda that the Americans would slaughter them. Many leapt into the sea, their screams echoing below as soldiers tried desperately to stop them. It was one of the most heartbreaking scenes of the Pacific War. As night fell again on June 26th, the island was quiet. Fires burned in the distance. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, and among the ruins Marines walked in silence, staring at the cost of victory. The Japanese generals who once smirked at island hopping had seen their empire's pride shattered, not by strategy alone, but by the unstoppable tide of industrial warfare and human will. The island of Saipan, and once thought untouchable, was now in American hands, and that single fact would shake Tokyo to its core. July 1944. Saipan falls. When the sun rose over Saipan on June 27, 1944, it revealed a sight that defied imagination. The beaches where the Marines had landed 3 weeks earlier were now graveyards, a mosaic of burned-out tanks, sunken landing craft, and shattered helmets strewn across the sand. The island's once green hills had turned gray from the relentless bombardment. Smoke still drifted from hidden fires that smoldered in caves and shell craters, and everywhere, the silence was broken only by the faint buzz of flies over the dead. For the first time since 1941, the American flag flew over a major piece of Japanese territory. General Holland Howland "Mad" Smith stood on a ridge near the captured airfield, hands clasped behind his back, his face expressionless. The cost had been staggering, over 14,000 American casualties, including some of the toughest units in the Marine Corps and Army. But strategically, the victory was beyond measure. Saipan was more than just another island. It was the gateway to Japan itself. From the newly captured airfields, B-29 superfortresses could now strike the Japanese home islands directly, including Tokyo, just 300 miles away. For the first time in the war, the Japanese mainland was within reach of American bombers. The psychological blow to Japan's leadership was catastrophic. On July 9th, organized resistance officially ended. But across Tokyo, disbelief turned into panic. The loss of Saipan meant the defense line, the so-called absolute national defense zone, had been broken. It also meant that Japan's dream of holding the Marianas as a buffer to protect the homeland was over. That same day, in the Imperial Palace, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo met with senior military and cabinet members. Reports from Saipan were grim. No reinforcements survived, no ships escaped, no troops surrendered. The emperor's anger was quiet but unmistakable. Tojo bowed and resigned within days, marking the beginning of the end for Japan's wartime leadership. In American command tents across the Pacific, the mood was a strange mix of exhaustion and realization. The Marines who survived the Great Banzai Charge sat silently, cleaning their rifles beside piles of captured swords and flags. Many didn't speak at all. They had seen courage beyond comprehension, both theirs and the enemy's. War correspondents described Saipan as a place where bravery and death had become the same thing. Yet even amid victory, a haunting sadness lingered. The cliffs of Marpy Point, later called Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, became silent monuments to the hundreds of civilians and soldiers who leapt to their deaths. Marines later found entire families still holding hands at the base of the cliffs. One American officer wrote in his diary, "We came to liberate, but what we found was tragedy beyond language." By July's end, Saipan was firmly under American control. Engineers cleared mines, repaired roads, and rebuilt airfields at record speed. Soon, massive bases began to rise. Hangars for the B-29s, fuel depots, radar towers, and anti-aircraft batteries. Every piece of machinery that arrived on the island was a symbol of the new phase of the Pacific War, the shift from island battles to the direct assault on Japan itself. And in the skies above Saipan, the engines of the superfortresses soon began to roar. The same airfields where Japanese planes once took off to defend the empire would now launch the weapons that would bring that empire to its knees. Still, beneath the strategic triumph, the cost of human life weighed heavy, not just in numbers, but in memory. For every mile of ground gained, for every inch of sand taken, thousands had fallen. The Pacific had always been a place of beauty, but on Saipan, it had become a graveyard for empires. July-August 1944, the shockwave of Saipan. In Tokyo, the loss of Saipan was not simply a military defeat, it was a national trauma. For years, Japanese generals had promised their people that the Imperial Army would fight the Americans far from the homeland. Saipan's fall shattered that illusion. It proved that the Pacific barrier could be breached, that the empire was no longer untouchable. On July 18, 1944, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the architect of Japan's expansion and the man who had once declared, "Victory will smile upon Japan," officially resigned. His cabinet collapsed with him. The political heart of wartime Japan fractured under the realization that the war was now unwinnable. The imperial palace fell into silence. Reports from Saipan described not just defeat, but annihilation. Entire divisions erased, civilians dead by their own hand, and American bombers already constructing bases within striking distance of Tokyo. For the Japanese high command, the implications were devastating. Saipan's loss meant that Guam and Tinian, nearby islands in the Marianas, would inevitably follow. And they did. Within weeks, American forces swept across them, completing the capture of the entire island chain. From these airfields, the U.S. 20th Air Force launched its first bombing raids over Japan later that year. What began with the fall of Saipan would culminate in the firebombing of Tokyo and, eventually, the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a sense, Saipan was the beginning of Japan's end. For the Americans, the victory came at a steep emotional cost. Soldiers wrote home describing the horror of the civilian suicides, the shock of fighting an enemy who refused to surrender, and the emptiness that followed survival. Marine Private James Martin wrote in a letter later published after the war, "We won Saipan, but I don't think anyone feels like celebrating. The whole island feels like a funeral." War photographers captured images that would haunt the world. Women clutching infants on cliff edges, Marines lowering flags over mass graves, and exhausted faces staring into a horizon that promised more battles ahead. In Washington, however, Saipan's victory was hailed as a strategic masterpiece. It validated Admiral Chester Nimitz's island-hopping strategy, a methodical leap across the Pacific, bypassing heavily fortified islands and capturing only those vital to air and sea control. The success also silenced critics who had called the plan reckless. By taking Saipan, the U.S. Navy had not only cut off Japan's southern supply lines but also placed itself within bombing range of the Emperor's palace. President Franklin D. Roosevelt reportedly said to his advisors, "From Saipan the road to Tokyo is open." Yet, for every map and headline celebrating victory, there were rows of fresh graves. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, the 27th Infantry, the Seabees, the Navy, each had left pieces of themselves on the island. As August arrived, the rebuilding began. Military engineers expanded Isley Field and constructed massive runways for the incoming B-29 superfortresses. The once quiet island was transformed into one of the most heavily fortified air bases in the Pacific. But for those who had fought there, Saipan remained sacred ground. Veterans would later describe standing on the beaches, watching the waves roll in, knowing beneath them lay thousands of men, American and Japanese, united in silence. The war would rage for another year, with bloodier battles still to come, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the final devastation of Japan. But after Saipan, one truth was clear. The Empire of Japan had begun its irreversible collapse. The island's cliffs, its coral beaches, and its burned villages stood as silent witnesses to the moment when the Pacific tide turned. Not just strategically, but symbolically. The Japanese generals who once smirked at island hopping had underestimated not just America's power, but its resolve. And from that miscalculation, an empire began to die. Saipan was more than a battle. It was a revelation, the moment the Pacific War's illusion of distance, invincibility, and divine protection was stripped away. For Japan, Saipan exposed a fatal truth. Courage alone could not overcome industrial might. The spirit of the samurai met the machinery of the modern world and was crushed beneath it. The island that Japanese generals once viewed as a distant outpost became the stage where an empire's destiny unraveled. In 3 weeks, centuries of pride, strategy, and propaganda collapsed under the weight of reality. For America, Saipan was both triumph and tragedy. It proved the genius of island hopping, but at a cost that defied celebration. Thousands of young men died on beaches that would never bear their names, fighting for an idea that stretched across the ocean. The beaches where they landed became quiet again. The coral grew over the wrecks. The waves washed away the footprints. But the echoes of those days, the screams, the gunfire, the final cries of banzai, remain embedded in the island's soil. From Saipan's airfields, bombers would soon rise to rain destruction upon Japan's cities, carrying the war from the islands to the homeland. And though that next chapter would bring the world closer to peace, it would also reveal how far humanity could fall in pursuit of victory. In the end, Saipan was not just another step toward Japan's surrender. It was the breaking point where faith met fact, where empire met endurance, and where the Pacific itself seemed to hold its breath. The Japanese generals who once smirked at the thought of American island hopping never lived to see what followed. But their arrogance, their miscalculations, and their faith in a fading empire ensured that history would remember Saipan not as a fortress, but as a warning. Because in war, as Saipan proved, pride dies long before nations do.